Okay, there we go. It's been a while since I did this, so apologies if anything seems a little screwy here. But a couple of my friends, and I am still on Nef's ESOU Discord, so I've been seeing a lot of talk about this. But apparently, ESO is going through this big upheaval in the latest update 35 PTS, and apparently people want me to talk about it. I don't play ESO anymore. I quit back in about a year and a half ago at this point, so probably update 30-ish, 30 or 29. So a lot of the stuff I won't be as familiar with. Like there are going to be some things that I just don't know about. While I have like on the surface kept up with the changes, it's kind of on a very surface level and not really like in depth or anything like that. But I have a general idea of how ESO PvE combat at the very least has changed over the past year and a half, just with conversations with friends about how ESO is doing and what they're doing in the game and all that stuff. So there are already plenty of other content creators who have already gone over the patch notes, so I'm really just going to give a very brief overview, hopefully a very brief overview of kind of what the changes are, the rationale behind it, and what I think this is going to mean for the game as a whole. Not just from an end game perspective, but also try to get a sense of the mid game perspective and the casual perspective as well. So there's two posts that you guys should read up on if you guys have not been keeping up. First is the Update 35 Combat Preview. So this was posted by Gilliam. And this basically was an attempt to basically sort of preempt the PTS patch notes for Update 35, kind of explaining what people should expect to see and the rationale behind it. Basically, Gilliam goes into really two main things. The big one being what he calls weaving, or light attack weaving. And so essentially what the devs view as sort of the gap between endgame players, the people who are doing vet hard mode trials, achievement runs, things like that, and casual players is light attack weaving. So as a result, they're going to take this opportunity to basically decrease the light attack damage. So weaving becomes a less of a contribution to your overall DPS. The idea being you're going to drop the ceiling, which is all fine and good. I think a lot of endgame players have been asking for a DPS nerf for a very long time, at least back since when I was playing. So this was going back 3-4 years ago. People have been asking for DPS nerfs because DPS just keeps on going up and up and up and up and up. I think this past patch, I think DPS was something, dummy DPS was something like 130k, 120k from the highest players, might be even higher. So definitely needs to be brought down. So something like this is fine, and if they just left it at that, I think it'd be okay. But that's sort of what they're doing with light attack weaving and light attacks and heavy attacks in general. They're basically making the change so that they do less damage overall, so that way your DPS is less reliant on good weaving. At least that's their rationale for doing this. The other thing that Gilliam sort of talked about were overall combat effects, and basically what it boils down to is they're basically going to take a lot of the damage over time and healing over time effects and basically double their duration and basically make adjustments, tweaks to the overall numbers so that they do roughly the same amount of damage overall. And when you take a look at the PTS again, I won't be going into any details specifically, but that is basically what they have done. They've basically gone through a lot of the abilities and basically standardized them to the damage over time abilities to last about 20 seconds and change the numbers, so overall damage would be approximately the same. At least that is the theory. So those are the two main things that they were talking about here. Now the big thing here, if you go over to the patch notes here, so obviously we're going to be taking just jumping right down to combat and gameplay because that's the most important part. But basically what they did was, instead of having heavy attacks scale off of weapon and spell damage, now they deal a flat amount of damage. And so these are all the numbers. I won't go into them too much, but basically based on a lot of the parsers that I've seen on PTS, and again, this is they made some changes to the target dummy, so it's not 100% one-to-one, but generally speaking, in terms of percentage of your overall DPS, light attacks have gone down. They're not quite as much as they were in the past. Generally speaking, currently on live, on the target dummy, your DPS, light attack DPS should be making up about 15 to 20% of your damage. Now I think people were saying they're closer to about 10% or so, so they've accomplished their goal of making light attacks contribute less to your overall DPS. Then of course they have a couple other things here. So the big one again is the damage over time. So they'll last 20 seconds and they'll tick on a 2-second frequency, rather than this sort of weird 2 seconds if they're single target, 1 second if they're AoEs, and deal about twice the amount of damage as a normal spammable. So basically what they've been doing is they basically increase the time, they sort of decrease the damage or kind of adjusted the damage so they deal a certain amount of damage, and they basically try to standardize it. But they also did the same thing with healing over time abilities, where they sort of adjusted the healing for healing over time abilities to kind of fit this sort of standardization. And then of course they did a bunch of other stuff here, some of which is pretty important, but we're just going to be talking more generally what they're doing here. So first of all, the light and heavy attack changes. So I mentioned earlier, if this was the only thing that they did to drop DPS, it would be probably not what I would do, but it would be okay. Honestly, I am not very keen on, at least I don't think this change is going to have the intended effect that they're going to see. So basically what Gilliam said in his sort of post was us, the devs, are trying to close the gap between the floor and the ceiling. As a quick sort of definition sort of standpoint here, when we talk about the ceiling, we're talking about basically the highest level players, the players who are doing those vet hard mode leaderboard runs on vet trials, things like that. When we talk about the floor, we're talking about casual players, or more accurately, what the average player is able to accomplish. This would encompass a lot of different people. This would encompass players like role players. This would encompass people who just casually solo quest, people who do normal dungeons, people who do vet dungeons, and basically everywhere in between. So, but when we talk about the floor, generally speaking, we're talking about the most casual of players and sort of what they're able to pull in relevant content. And so what Gilliam was saying was they want to close that gap. Basically, they want to take that gap between the ceiling and the floor and basically shrink it. What they're doing here with light attacks, basically nerfing light attack damage overall, is rather than raising the... So there's basically two ways to close the gap. You can either raise the floor and keep the ceiling where it is, or you can lower the ceiling and keep the floor where it is. And both of those have different intended side effects depending on what direction you want your game to go. Generally speaking, raising the floor but keeping the ceiling level will basically, in some respects, make the game a little bit easier for casual players. Basically what that means is because you're raising the floor, everybody's doing more damage, everybody feels more powerful. You kind of think of it almost as power creep, if you guys are familiar with that term, where you just gradually get a little bit stronger and stronger and stronger with each iterative patch. That would be what raising the floor would do. Basically, it would make everybody be a little bit stronger, but the top end players will still be, at the level they're at, maybe increase it a little bit. So generally speaking, when you raise the floor, you're also raising the ceiling, but the goal would be to obviously raise the floor more than the ceiling is raised, so that gap, while it still exists, it's smaller overall. The other way, and this is what they're doing, is that they're lowering the ceiling but keeping the floor the same. So what they're doing is basically nerfing the high-end players so they deal less damage, but the changes are not really changing the baseline DPS. Or if anything, it might end up lowering the floor. With this, the goal is to lower the ceiling more than you're lowering the floor. So again, that gap is closing, but everything is going down as a result. Generally speaking, people don't like it. Players don't like it when you nerf them. Taking away power, taking away a player's agency is generally not a good direction to take the game, although it might be necessary, especially in ESO's case, where when DPS and damage numbers are going really, really high or power creep has gone too far up, you do need to bring everything back down. Now, nerfing the ceiling and consequently the floor a little bit here, that has the effect of basically, again, weakening players overall. So they both basically have the same overall end goal, which is closing the gap. They just accomplish it in different ways. And so Gilliam's sort of rationale for the devs for wanting to close this gap is to basically make content easier to design, essentially, is kind of what they're going for here. Now, with these heavy light attack and heavy attack changes, they are drastically changing the ceiling. So they are bringing the ceiling down to the DPS numbers that I've seen on the dummy. Again, not entirely comparable, but it's about a roughly 20 to 25% drop in DPS, which is good from like the high-end experienced players. That being said, you also got to consider nerfs from the casual player's perspective as well. So remember that these sort of blanket nerfs affect not just the high-end players, but also mid-game players and casual players. So take that 20 and 25% drop from the most experienced players. So these are the players that have almost perfect weaving, 0.9 to 0.95 light attack ratios, very good dot uptime, very good buff uptimes, things like that. And think about what that would mean for your average mid-game player. So this is a player that might be wanting to get into vet trials, or the average casual player who, their light attack, they might not light attack at all, right? So for a player that doesn't light attack at all, these changes might not really mean much in terms of strictly the light attack, heavy attack changes, because they don't use them to begin with. So they might just be using their abilities, they might not be light attack weaving. For the mid-game player, this is where they're going to hurt the most. This is the demographic that's going to hurt the most from these changes, because their light attacks already, light attack weaving, their light attack ratios already probably aren't great. They're probably somewhere between like 0.7 to 0.8, maybe as low as 0.65 or 0.6. And so light attacks right now deal a pretty hefty amount of damage. So even though their light attack ratio might be on the low end, they're still doing decent DPS. With these changes, because light attack damage has gone down, their light attack ratio is also low, which means their light attack damage is going to go down by a much larger percent than those players who have much higher light attack ratios. So mid-game players, they're going to see a much bigger drop in their overall damage from the 2025 that these very experienced players are going to see. And the worse your light attack ratio is, the harder these changes are going to hit you. So a casual player who light attack weaves every once in a while, they're going to see a much bigger drop in the overall damage compared to a high-end player, because just light attacks from the lower you go, the greater proportion they're making of their overall your overall damage contribution. So that's just strictly from light attack, heavy attack. So they're hurting the high end like they should, they're dropping the ceiling, but they're also dropping everybody else by a larger margin because of these changes, and that's just the way that the math would end up working out. The other big change that's going to hurt players, I think, is going to be the damage over time changes. So if you just read these, it sounds like they're going to try to standardize everything, which is a good goal to have, I think, in overall game design, especially in MMOs where you have a lot of content that you want to cover. Standardizing things does make things easier to balance. So if you think about things like Final Fantasy is the MMO that I'm playing right now, their combat balance is, generally speaking, overall mostly positive. There have been a couple of changes that have caused some controversy, but if you take a look at the overall damage spread of the DPS classes, of the tanks, of the healers, they're actually not that far apart when you consider the utility that some of the classes bring. So for example, you take a look at Red Mage, for example, which does have a group mitigation and a group buff. Their personal DPS is going to be overall lower than somebody like a Black Mage, which is just strictly, I just do damage, I don't have any group buffs at all. So in terms of balance wise, that's good, and part of it is because they standardize a lot of things in Final Fantasy. All the dots, they tick on 3 seconds. Every 3 seconds you get a tick of a dot. Potencies, while they do vary from here and there, they are almost directly comparable as long as you're taking a look at within a single job. And so standardizing things does go a long way in terms of balancing things out. And that's not to say Final Fantasy is perfect, but they do have a much better sense of job balance than ESO does. All the jobs are basically viable at endgame for Final Fantasy. While there are jobs that are going to be stronger, the way that they balance it out basically means, every single job, you see them in endgame content, Ultimate, Savage, etc. So standardizing things is a good goal to have. The issue is when you standardize things, you kind of have to make sure that you're affecting everybody in a way where it's even, basically. It's all about the equity, basically. So in their desire to basically nerf the high-end players, they're also taking a massive nerf to the mid-game players particularly, but also casual players. So really quickly, going back to damage over time effects, they have standardized these, which is, again, I think a step in the right direction if they're going for overall game balance, but I don't like the changes that they've made. 20 seconds overall is a very long time in terms of ESO combat. Basically, the goal behind ESO is basically to lay down as many damage over time effects as you can and then use spamble in betweens. So basically, by standardizing these damage over time abilities, what you do is, a side effect is you're basically kind of neutering class identity to a certain extent, because now in ESO, a lot of what you have are sort of abilities that everybody has, So things like Endless Hail, which is under the bow line, Deadly Cloak, which is under the dual wield line, for example. Destructive Clench under the Destructive Staff line. These are abilities that everybody has access to regardless of what your class is. Now obviously there are class damage over time abilities which are unique to each class, but basically you're boiling down the rotation for ESO to lay down 4 or 5 dots and then spamble for the other 15 seconds, which is for some people great. A simplified rotation does help out some people in terms of playstyle, but it does end up sort of stagnating sort of the rotations because now they all look very, very similar, and it also takes away from sort of the fun of ESO combat. So ESO's combat has traditionally been marketed as more resource management and fast-paced compared to other MMOs which have a longer global cooldown, for example. And so when you boil it down to 4 or 5 dots and then 15 spambles, that's not really exciting for a rotation. The class I played before I quit was Dragon Knight, and we had a lot of different duration dots. We had Flames of Oblivion, which was 15 seconds, Eruption, which was 24, Unstable Wall, which was 14 seconds, I believe, Engulfing Flames, which was 10. So you had all these different dot timers, and basically what that boiled down to was your rotation was very dynamic. And that's what made DK fun for me. That's what made ESO combat in general fun, when you had all these different duration timers that you kind of had to manage. While standardizing does make things easier for players to learn and players to get into endgame, it also makes things boring, basically. One common complaint that you kind of hear about ESO, or not ESO, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, and all these other more traditional MMOs, is that the combat feels very similar across different jobs. And having played all different jobs in Final Fantasy, I can agree to a certain extent that there is definitely some, like, if you can do Dragoon well, you will do well on Reaper sort of level. There are obviously some job differences with your abilities, when you want to use your rotations, your abilities, long cooldowns, things like that. But generally speaking, if you're good on one melee class, you'll typically pick up another melee class relatively quickly because of this standardization of, your standard 1-2-3 combo sort of deal here. So there is that aspect as well, that you're basically taking away class identity, and you're basically neutering sort of this dynamic rotation and simplifying combat to the degree where it becomes very boring, where you just have 4 or 5 dots and then you do 15 spambles and you just repeat, which for some people, more casual players, that might be welcome, right? They might like something where you just have to hit a dot every 20 seconds instead of every 10, or where instead of having to do this dynamic rotation when you're learning something like Dragon Knight or Sork, instead having a more static rotation here. So there is some benefits, but there are also huge costs as well, and you kind of have to balance that out here. Now, in terms of what I think these changes will do to the overall health of the game, already on ESO-U in particular, and when I've talked with some of my friends who do play at the higher end levels of gameplay, there's a lot of people who are saying if these changes go through, they're going to leave ESO. A lot of high-end players are going to leave. Nephis in particular has made a whole video about how bad these patch notes are, and there are other content creators too who have noted about how unhealthy these changes are to the overall health of the game, of the overall combat of the game. I also think that this is going to hurt mid-game players particularly hard. Again, these are the players who are getting into endgame content, who are doing things like vet DLC dungeons, for example, who want to get into vet trials. This damage nerf is big, and from the looks of things, they are not rebalancing content to adjust for these damage nerfs. So one of the things you got to be very aware of as when you're rebalancing things is how does this affect older content, and how is this going to affect newer content. So from what I haven't played these trials at all, but from what I've heard, a lot of these, and from what I've seen from Sunspire, a lot of these newer trials that they're going for here are just like the health is ridiculously high, and DPS is expected to be at a certain level in order to clear that boss on hard mode. And so if you're not adjusting for that, with the lower DPS, these fights might become much more difficult, if not impossible, for certain groups. So a group, for example, who is progressing through Rock Robe hard mode, if these changes go through, they're going to have a much harder time, because the DPS check is not going to change, but the DPS is going to go down. And so there might be the case where, a group that was just barely making the DPS check, let's say the DPS check was like 400k or something, and they were at 420, or 440 or 450, and this change goes through, and they do take that 20% hit, Therefore, 50 DPS now becomes 360, but the DPS check stays at 400. They're obviously not going to be able to pass it. So that's sort of where progression groups and mid-game players are going to get hurt the most. When this damage nerf, which again is going to be universal and is going to be felt even greater the less experienced you are. The lower your DPS is, the greater percentage nerf you're going to get. That's just generally how nerfs work. The very experienced players will be able to basically adjust their rotations very, very easily because they know the game inside and out, they know the game mechanics, so they'll be able to adjust and minimize that delta, that difference in that nerf percentage. But the mid-game players and the casual players who might not know the game mechanics as well, who might not be as experienced, they aren't going to be able to make those same adjustments, and so they're going to see a much larger percentage of the overall nerf. So while their absolute numbers might be different, in terms of percentages, it's going to be much larger. So think about 120 to 100k, that's 20,000 DPS difference, but in terms of a percentage difference, that's only roughly a little over 15%. But a mid-game player who's, let's say, hitting like 80k and then drops, let's say down to 60 or even 55k, that's still a 20%, that's still a 20k drop, but the percentage-wise, going from 80 to 60, that's a 25% difference. So they're seeing a much larger percentage change, even if the absolute change is going to be similar. Which does make a very big difference in how players perceive their overall power, as well as what they're actually capable of doing. So these changes overall, I don't think they're very healthy for the overall health of the game. A lot of endgame players, like I mentioned, are saying if these changes go through, they're going to quit. And while my personal opinion is you should balance around endgame players because they know the game the best, driving them away is also very bad for the game. Because these endgame players are, generally speaking, going to be the content creators. If you take a look at any game at all, the most popular content creators, the ones who basically provide free advertising for your game, are going to be the people who are high-end players. Look at Elden Ring, for example, a popular game. A lot of the streams that you see that are most popular are going to be the speedrunners. Take a look at Final Fantasy. So a lot of the most popular streamers are either people who have very outgoing personalities, so they're more personality streamers, but you also see a lot of people take a look at the high-end content streamers. Ren, damn it, what's his name? I'm forgetting what his name is. Ilya, for example. Xeno, those people are players who play at savage level content, and they are relatively popular content creators who advertise things. Take a look at, and then take a look at YouTube guides. A lot of the players who put out savage guides for Final Fantasy, who put out rotation guides for ESO, these are the high-end players. Skinny Cheeks, he is a high-end raider in ESO. If he leaves, there goes all of his guides, there goes all of his videos for ESO players. And for the mid-game players, those guides are really good learning tools. For casual players, those guides are pretty decent learning tools. So if you're driving away your endgame players, you're actually, you're going to end up hurting mid-game and casual players even more because now they're going to have fewer resources. Well, the resources they're going to have are going to be either outdated or just plain flat out wrong. So thinking like, of Zynode, for example, a lot of the stuff that he has on his website is either outdated or just wrong entirely, and these casual players are picking up these builds, expecting to do very well in vet trials, only to learn that their build's not that great. And, what is that? Where does that leave players? Having a bad experience is not great. So these changes overall, based on what I have seen and what I have read, from players who are playing ESO, from my friends, from Discord messages, from the patch notes themselves, because I did look through the entirety of the patch notes, very, very briefly. I didn't take a look at any specific numbers or anything, just generally what was going on. I don't think these notes, these PTS patch notes, if they go live as is going to be good for the health of the ESO game. Now, this all is going to depend on what the developers want out of the game. If they want to cater to the casual players, then go this route. Because casual players, they don't know any better, right? They don't know that their damage is going down because they just don't know the game mechanics. I'm going to be honest here, the casual players just don't know anything about the game mechanics. They don't know anything about what their damage potential is. They don't know anything about how sets work together. They aren't going to give a shit. They're just going to go around questing, ERPing, or whatever they do, and life goes on for them. The mid-game players, the high-end players, the players who are trying to get into harder content, vet dungeons, vet DLC dungeons, vet trials, vet hard mode trials, they're the ones who are going to feel this the most, and they're the ones who are going to end up leaving. So if ZOS's goal is to cater to the casual players, then they're accomplishing it. But if their goal is to create a healthier game overall, a long-lasting game, they're driving away the players that will contribute the most, in my opinion, to the longevity of the game, because it is the endgame players that do, stick with the game. I stuck with the game for a while, even though I wasn't completely happy with it, because I enjoyed the combat. And at some point, I was like, you know what, all these sweeping changes are enough. I can't deal with the 3-month swings, so I'm gonna leave. And there are plenty of other examples of high-end raiders who have left ESO because they got frustrated with the combat team, the developers. So overall, those are just my thoughts. Again, I'm not an ESO player anymore, but just taking a look at kind of what's happening here, I'm kind of glad I ended up leaving ESO for Final Fantasy. I enjoy Final Fantasy much more than I enjoyed ESO. While there are some obviously combat changes in Final Fantasy, they are far less whiplash. There's far less whiplash, and generally speaking, I like the fight designs more in Final Fantasy. ESO right now seems like, when you look at Sunspire, a lot of it is just damage sponges. They just bump up health. And again, the devs, the direction they're taking here, just sort of tells me that they don't play their games enough. They don't play their games at the same level that the high-end players do. They're not the ones that are being, getting these achievements, these no-death speedrun hard mode achievements. And as such, they're just sort of out of the loop, and they just don't know how the game works, and making these changes based on what their numbers are telling them, not realizing that numbers are not exactly, not telling the whole story. But yeah, those are just my thoughts on this whole, ESO Update 35 debacle. So just kind of wanted to get my thoughts out there. People were kind of asking me for my personal thoughts as sort of an outsider at this point. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Enjoy this video, I guess. It's probably one of the few I'm going to do over the year, but yeah, just, if you guys want anything else from me, whether that's Final Fantasy, ESO, well, maybe not ESO, but like Final Fantasy, other video games, Monster Hunter, I'm in Monster Hunter Rise now, Sunbreak's out. If you want anything, see anything like that, or just me talking about games, just let me know down in the comments. I haven't really been making content, and I don't really intend on making content that much anymore, but, if people want, I'll make stuff. But yeah, that's it. Those are my thoughts. Links down below to these, as well as some other content creators and their reactions to the patch notes, in case you guys want a more, broader view. It's always nice to get different opinions, things like that. But yeah, that's it. Signing off now. See you around.